My name is Simon Vazire, and I'm the Dean of Sydney Law School, and it is my pleasure to welcome you here tonight to the beautiful land upon which we meet. I would like to acknowledge country. I am not First Nations, but I would first like to, most importantly, as a matter of protocol, acknowledge the First Nations of the Gadigal, the people of the Gadi. And if you don't know what a Gadi is, you can see them just out there. We've had them planted there. They're amazing native trees that grow in and around Sydney. And I'd like to pay respects to elders past and present. I'm particularly delighted to be welcoming you tonight to this event, which is the beginning and the inauguration of our Trust in Knowledge talk seminar series. And it's something we've been talking about for a while in the university, and I have to acknowledge the terrific support we've had from Duncan Iverson, our former Deputy Vice-Chancellor Research, and of course, while he steps down from that important role, this is, I suppose, one of the legacies that he personally committed himself. How can we do things better? I'd like to introduce Professor Kathy Vazire, who's representing the Office of the Deputy Vice-Chancellor Research. Professor Beloff, unfortunately, can't be with us tonight. But Kathy Vazire will be giving us a background on the Trust in Knowledge talks, and she's going to introduce the guest speaker. And I'd like to welcome Professor Simine Vazire from Melbourne. Isn't it wonderful that we can actually cross borders now? And I hope you haven't been suffering too much exposure coming here and interacting with people who, you know, it is a really wonderful thing that we can actually interact, not on Zoom. So look, I'm delighted that we're able to really get back into the business of hosting events like this. And of course, we will be recording these events too. So look, and I'd like to thank Kathy for also stepping in. She's a Professor of Allied Health with a focus on strategic partnerships here at Sydney University. She was the immediate past Dean of the Faculty of Health Sciences, and her research focuses on integrating her physiotherapy, biomedical engineering, and physiology backgrounds to improve health outcomes. She's published extensively in the area of musculoskeletal health and has developed guidelines and position statements for best practice in diagnosis and management of various musculoskeletal conditions. And so with that, I would like to hand over to Kathy, who will introduce our guest speaker.
Thank you. And oh, look, I can't tell you how excited I am to be here today. And I don't know why the whole university isn't here for something just so critical. But before we get into it, I would also like to acknowledge the Gadigal people, the traditional owners of this land. How appropriate to acknowledge them and focus on that when we're talking about trust, truth in knowledge, and trust, I guess, is part of that. So as Simon said, I'm not purely random. I am acting in Kathy Beloff's role tonight, or, well, for a few months. So these are the kinds of things that I'm really pleased to be taking over. So I first of all want to thank, on behalf of the DVC Research and also the whole university community, thank the Sydney Law School for hosting this, the inaugural series, and also Professor Simine Vazire for providing the inaugural talk tonight about where are the self-correcting mechanisms in science. And I'm assuming she's going to give us the answer. That's what I'm hanging out for. But just a few words of background, that this, as you know, I'm sure you're all aware and have been hanging out for it to happen. It's a new seminar series, the Truth in Knowledge seminar series. It's supported by the DVC Research, and it's an initiative that aims to encourage discussion and collaboration to produce robust and reliable research across the university community, and to promote and provide a forum for sharing ideas and approaches across disciplines. And it kind of, I don't know, when you say that, it sounds really obvious to me, like, aren't we doing that? Well, we're not. And it's really critical that we do, actually. But the idea for this, the open whole of university seminar series focusing on research transparency, on integrity, on reproducibility, was initially proposed and formulated by colleagues from 4 faculties. So Jennifer Byrne from Medicine and Health, and I'm very familiar with her original work some years ago, that exhaustive work that absolutely horrified me. And so I started to be personally interested as well. With her, there's Jason Chin from Law, Nick Enfield from Arts and Social Sciences. Jason's here. And Nick Enfield. Oh, I'm just pointing out who's not here. Alex Holcomb from Science, I think is here, yeah. And Simon Bronnett, as you know. So this is right across the university, and a really, I want to say awesome strategy, but I say awesome a lot. It's much more important than that. They've been instrumental, this group, coming together and formulating this strategy that's got us to here today, to this launch. So genuinely thank you from DVCR, from the university community, to all of you for getting together and working in your spare time on getting this whole strategy happening. So I now have the honour of introducing Professor Simine Vazire. So we're absolutely honoured to have Professor Vazire as a special guest speaker to launch the whole strategy. She's a professor in the Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences at the University of Melbourne. She's made and continues to make great contributions to understanding the problems in science and improving them. Her research examines both people's self-knowledge of their personality and behaviour, and also the individual and institutional practices and norms in science, and the degree to which these norms encourage or impede self-correction and credibility, what we're talking about tonight. Simine was a member of the US National Academy of Science Science Study Committee on Replicability and Reproducibility, and co-founded the Society for the Improvement of Psychological Science. She's a board member of PLOS and the Berkeley Institute for Transparency in the Social Sciences. She's also the editor-in-chief of Collabra Psychology and has served as editor at several other journals. I don't think there could genuinely be a more impressive colleague to launch this seminar series. So please join me in welcoming Simine to deliver the inaugural Trust in Knowledge talk, Where Are the Self-Correcting Mechanisms in Science? And you will give us the answer, right?
Thanks so much for coming, and thanks especially to Jason Chin for spearheading this. I'm really excited about this talk series and a bit jealous. I might try to copy it at the University of Melbourne. And so I'm excited to talk to you today about some of my research and thoughts about what makes science self-correcting. And I want to begin by acknowledging my collaborators, so Giulia Bottesini and Sarah Schiavoni. They're PhD students at the University of California, Davis, where I was before moving to Melbourne. My colleague at the University of Melbourne and co-lab director Fiona Fiddler, and your own Alex Holcomb. And so a lot of my ideas and a lot of the work I'll be presenting today was really heavily influenced by conversations with them, and some of it is work that I did with them or that they did primarily. So I teach undergraduate research methods, or I have a lot of times, and a question that comes up in the beginning is what makes science different from other ways of knowing? How is science different from pseudoscience? Why should we trust science? What is it about science that makes it trustworthy? And once you start teaching this stuff, you start questioning your own reasons, right? And the more you dig into it, the more of a puzzle it becomes. And this is interesting because it's also echoed in some survey results. So in the US, there's a survey done every few years with a national representative sample of respondents. And here I want you to focus on the green bars, which are the % of respondents that say that they trust scientists. And you can see that these bars are consistently high, and they're higher than for almost any other group. Trust in scientists is higher than trust in religious leaders, the news media, elected officials, et cetera. But in that very same survey, those same respondents are also asked other questions that are more specific about scientists. So things like, do they believe that scientists provide accurate information and admit their conflicts of interest and so on? And these answers seem to be in conflict with their overall trust in scientists. And I want you to focus here on the bottom row in the green dots, which is the percent of respondents that agree that scientists admit and take responsibility for mistakes. Only 10 to 15% of respondents agree to this, which is not too surprising, right? Scientists are human. Humans tend not to admit and take responsibility for mistakes. So it's not too surprising that people have a realistic view of scientists, but then it raises the question of how come they trust scientists then, if they're aware that scientists are human and won't often admit and take responsibility for mistakes. So the first potential reason to trust scientists, that scientists are somehow noble and pure and objective. Okay, nobody really thinks that, right? So what's another possible reason why we should trust science? Maybe there's something special about the scientific method. Maybe there's a formula that if we follow, it makes our findings trustworthy. And now philosophers of science have pretty convincingly destroyed that possibility. There just isn't any such formula or recipe that we can follow or be trained to follow and then produce trustworthy results. And this was articulated well in a blog post where William Storage wrote, it's going to be tough to find a set of methods that let evolution, cosmology, and botany in while keeping astrology, cold fusion, and parapsychology out. There just is no such formula or recipe. So the second possible reason why we should trust science, the scientific method, is not so viable either. So where does that leave us? Why should we trust science? The answer that a lot of philosophers of science agree on these days, and that was echoed in many methodologists' work, including Don Campbell from my own field in 1984, is that it's a social process. It's not something about individuals, but something about the scientific community. As he put it, the dependability of scientific reports comes from a social process rather than from dependence upon the honesty and competence of any single experimenter. Organized distrust produces trustworthy reports. So the answer is probably something social, something in the culture of science. And I would argue that the reason that organized distrust makes science trustworthy is that it fosters self-correction. By having a community that values organized distrust, then we have a better chance of detecting each other's errors and correcting them, right? So it's a way to prioritize self-correction. Okay, so let's take this idea of self-correction, this idea that science is self-correcting. We hear that a lot. If you want to kill some time, you can search for this phrase on Twitter or your favorite social media platform. It's pretty fascinating what you find. So as I was teaching about these things that make science special, again, I was pushed to answer the question of like, okay, so where is this self-correction? Where can I find it? And again, there's a few possible answers. So one that we see people allude to is the idea that peer review is the self-correcting mechanism in science, that errors are caught during peer review, and a peer-reviewed finding is one that we can trust. Another possibility is that maybe individual peer-reviewed findings aren't trustworthy, but we have this idea that there's an evidence pyramid with things like systematic reviews and meta-analyses at the top, and the conclusions that come from those higher levels of evidence, those are the ones that we can trust. And the self-correction happens as we move up the evidence pyramid. A third possibility is that time somehow, maybe magically, corrects errors. And so we can trust that things that stand the test of time and make it into textbooks, those are trustworthy findings. Now, unfortunately, recent events in many fields, including my own field of psychology, suggest that these mechanisms haven't worked. So you may have heard of the replication crisis, which affected psychology. My own subfield of social and personality psychology was perhaps the most directly affected, but it's a problem that has spread and has been found in almost every field where there's been an investigation into replication. It's spread to many other social sciences, economists, but also biomedicine and many other social and life sciences. In psychology, many of the findings that have been called into question are findings that have made it into textbooks, that did make it past peer review, that did find support from things like meta-analyses and systematic reviews. You may have heard of some of these findings. These are not like just the latest, hot off the press finding. These are things that we thought were really trustworthy. And it's not to say that none of these findings are true, but that there's now serious questions about their validity or their robustness. And you might say, okay, well, isn't that science self-correcting? Maybe this is it. This is science operating as it should. And indeed, some people have argued that, including some of the most eminent people in my field. So this is a quote from a chapter in the Annual Review of Psychology, which is by three of the really most important leaders in the field. So they say, all this is normal science, not crisis. A replication failure is not a scientific problem. It is an opportunity to find limiting conditions and contextual effects. Of course, studies don't always replicate. Another place where we find this argument is in the report from the National Academy of Sciences Study Committee on Replicability and Reproducibility, which is the committee that I was a member of, but resigned from actually. And this is what the report says about so it was a committee specifically tasked with dealing with problems of replication and reproducibility in science. And one of the early chapters, we had to talk about in what cases is scientific error normal and acceptable, and when is it a sign that there's a problem. And in the final report, this is a quote from that chapter: the advent of new scientific knowledge that displaces or reframes previous knowledge should not be interpreted as weakness in science. Now, I agree with that in many cases, but we can't ask for a blank check from the public to make any and all errors, make the same error over and over again, make unforced errors, right? We have to distinguish between normal science, normal errors, and things that we could have prevented or things that are a sign of science going off track. The other thing that's interesting to me about some of these quotes and others like them is that they're often made by the very same people who actually did not welcome the corrections and the replications and so on. So some of the same people who made statements like this, patting themselves on the back for the self-correcting mechanisms in psychology, describe the people doing replications or finding and correcting errors in psychology with phrases like replication bullies, human scum, methodological terrorists, second stringers, destructive iconoclasts, shameless little bullies, and one of my favorites, accuracy fetishists, which I will wear proudly. And I can stand up here and rattle these off and laugh about them, but at the same time, these were deeply personal insults against people who were doing something that allows us to stand here and say science is self-correcting, right? And here's one quote, one context for one of these quotes. The human scum was in an article in the Chronicle of Higher Education by Tom Bartlett, where he interviewed eminent researchers, asking them what they think about people like my friends who were doing replications and so on. And he said, as one tenured professor I spoke with recently put it, I think they're human scum. So it feels a bit weird for these same people to pat themselves on the back about how self-correcting science is. We can't simultaneously claim that this is normal science and call the people doing the correction human scum. And indeed, I don't think what's happening in psychology and many other fields is normal science. And that's one of the big problems I had with the National Academy of Sciences Study Committee report and how they handled this issue. The report, in my opinion, didn't grapple with the admittedly thorny issue of when errors are evidence of normal science correcting itself and when things have gone off the rails. Okay, so in my opinion, normal self-correction doesn't look like sudden drastic loss of credibility of an entire field. And this rest of this cartoon, which we often don't see, is maybe a warning sign for those in the field that want to claim that this is normal. So at least in the case of my field, which I know best, but I suspect is not unique, these potential self-correction mechanisms did not work. They didn't prevent us from coming to a crisis of credibility. So what does normal self-correction, what does a healthy self-correcting field look like? And the goal of my talk today is to really try to identify the mechanisms that we should expect in a field. And this is something I've been trying to look for and do for a while. And I was very excited when a book came out recently by a historian of science, Naomi Oreskes, who talks a lot about trust in science. And her book is called Why Trust Science? And she has a chapter about what makes science trustworthy. And towards the end of the chapter, she gets a little bit more concrete and she says, how do we know that there are self-correcting mechanisms in science? The same way we know other empirical facts, through observation. And she says, when we observe scientists, we find that they have developed a variety of practices for vetting knowledge, for identifying problems and attempting to correct them. But it stays on this relatively abstract level. I was frustrated that there were no concrete discussions of what these self-correcting mechanisms look like. And I think this is a very idealistic portrait of science. And maybe a more realistic one is from a tweet by James Heathers, who's a Sydney Uni grad and one of the methodological terrorists in this movement, really important person in this movement. So in his tweet, he wrote, in reality, mechanisms to correct bad science are slow, unreliably enforced, capricious, run with only the barest nod towards formal policy, and confer almost no reward and sometimes punitive elements for a complainant who might use them. Okay, so remember we said it was something about organized distrust, a social process that makes science self-correcting. So let's look for signs of this social process. What would that look like? So I'm going to argue today that there are two core components to organized distrust and to a field that prioritizes self-correction. The first is transparency, so we can't correct errors if we can't detect them in the first place. And the second is what I'll call critical appraisal or just criticism, which obviously is important also for detecting errors. So I use a metaphor where transparency is like lifting the hood on a car. So it's saying, here, come and look. You can look at everything I did and check for yourself. I'm not going to ask you to take my word for it. One researcher I talked to described it as giving your critics ammunition. And I think he meant it in a way that he was arguing against transparency, that we can't expect people to give their critics ammunition. But actually, I think that's exactly a big part of what makes science trustworthy, is that that's what we're signing up for. We're signing up for handing over to our critics all the information they need to find errors in our work. The second part in this metaphor is actually having people go in and look for problems, right? Transparency is nice, but you actually need to use it to go in and look to see if there are errors. So I'll talk about each of these two pillars a little bit and give some concrete examples of what I think it looks like when a field truly prioritizes organized distrust and self-correction, starting with transparency. So first I'll go through and list some of the things that I think make a field more transparent, make research in a field more transparent, and then I'll dig a little bit deeper into some of these individual things. So one is just making the research outputs themselves, the articles, publicly available, either as open access articles or at a minimum as a preprint. If the article is only available behind a paywall, then it's not truly transparent and accessible. The second is being transparent about conflicts of interest so that readers can make up their own mind about the chances of bias. And then researchers should be transparent about what instruments or measures they used in their research, the data itself whenever possible, the analysis plan that was decided on before analyzing the data, the analysis code itself, and then also the contributions of different members of the research team, who did what, both to give credit to those people and also to assign responsibility. Okay, so next I'm going to present a little bit of data on just some of these things, looking at the state of things in science, focusing mostly on psychology, but I'll try to draw in examples from other fields as well. So first is the availability of articles. One of the nice things about the kind of replication crisis and parallel open science movement is that there's been huge improvements in the technology available to make things transparent and the uptake in these technologies. So for example, for open access to papers, we now have preprint servers for many different fields. And this has existed for a long time in some fields like physics and mathematics, but now more and more fields are developing and using their own preprint servers. And this graph from 2019 is some research looking at the number of articles posted on various preprint servers across different fields. I'll warn you that the y-axis is different on each graph, so these are not all comparable, but you see that in many fields, there's a pretty dramatic increase over time. Again, this is from 2019 going backwards a few years. Next, there's a lot of data out there on availability of data, which is not super comforting. There's not very much original data available in many fields. I'll give you an example that's a little bit older from 2006 that I think is really interesting and telling from my own field of psychology. And this was a paper that was published where the researchers originally had a completely different research goal. They wanted to reach out to authors of papers, get their original data so that they could test their research question. And they found that it was so hard to get data from original authors that that became their paper. It became a meta-research paper about the fact that data is not available. And this was shocking to them in part because the authors they contacted had published their work in a journal that requires them to share their data upon request. So they had in principle agreed to share their data with other researchers when they receive a request. So what happened when they received a request? So this is the results of their attempts. So they found that 11% of researchers shared their data on the first request and another 16% shared after reminders, but 35% refused or said they were unable to share. 14% just never replied, and 20% said they would share but didn't follow through. And then on contribution, so there's been a lot of new developments in this area as well. Activity to try to replace or supplement authorship with this idea of contributorship, so that more of the research team and efforts can be recognized and more information, more specific information can be shared with readers about who did what. And so your own Alex Holcomb has been one of the people working on this, developing a tool called Tenzing that makes it easy to identify the different roles that each member of the research team played, and then it creates a nice summary of the contributorship. And then just to give an overview of open science practices in general, so sharing of research instruments, sharing of the original data, and sharing of analysis plan, I'm going to show you the results of a survey, and this is self-reports from researchers. So researchers across 5 different social sciences were contacted in, I think it was 2018, and asked, have you used any of these practices? Have you ever posted your data? Have you ever posted your research instruments? Have you ever shared your pre-analysis plan? And asked to retrospect when they first did it. So take these with a grain of salt. My other line of research is on the accuracy of self-reports. But what you can see here is that according to retrospective self-reports, most people have engaged in at least one of these practices, although they report having only started engaging in these practices relatively recently. And the most common was posting data, followed by posting study instruments, and then pre-registration of research plans is the slowest, but it has continued to increase since then. But the nice thing about these things is that we don't have to take researchers' word for it. We can actually look and see if this kind of transparency exists in a field. Is it common for researchers to make their articles available, to make their data available, to specify who contributed what to the project? There's also another kind of transparency, which I won't talk about as much, but is just as important, which is transparency in the process of peer review. And actually, I would add transparency in all kinds of processes, university level processes like hiring, promotion, investigations into research misconduct, et cetera. All of these processes themselves should also have some accountability and some level of transparency. Now, there's debate about how much transparency, right? There is room for privacy and confidentiality in many of these processes. In the case of journal-based peer review, I would argue that the content of the reviews themselves should be shared publicly, not necessarily the reviewers' identities, but the comments that the reviewers make and the comments that the editors make. There's absolutely no reason to hide that information away. So first of all, many readers could benefit from reading the content of those reviews. And even if I can't understand the content of the reviews, I can get a sense of how thorough the review process was. So it's a form of accountability for journals. They claim that they're extremely selective. Well, show us your process. At least they should name the handling editor on papers so that we have a chance to identify things like conflicts of interest between editors and authors, or rings where people might accept each other's papers. You know, I'll accept your paper and then I'll submit my paper to your journal and you'll accept my paper. And then journals could disclose things like how long articles have been in review. And then there's, again, a debate about whether we should disclose the identity of reviewers. I see a lot of pros and cons there, but these discussions should be happening, and a lot more of the process can be transparent. And again, we can look for these things. This is something we can evaluate a field on, even if we don't understand the content of that field very well. So even an outsider has a chance to evaluate some of these things. Okay, so that's one of the 2 pillars of organized distrust. We need to have things be transparent in order to be able to evaluate, to see if there are errors and correct them. However, it's only half the story, and it's really important to remember that transparency is not the same thing as quality and quality control. And this point was made really well by Andrew Gelman in a paper he wrote. It's a very short paper. I recommend it, called Honesty and Transparency Are Not Enough. And he said, consider the consequences for a researcher who eagerly accepts the message of ethical and practical values of sharing and openness, but does not learn about the importance of data quality. They could then just be driving very carefully into a brick wall, conducting transparent experiment after transparent experiment and continuing to produce and publish noise, right? Transparency doesn't guarantee quality. Transparency doesn't guarantee credibility. We shouldn't believe something just because it's transparent, but transparency guarantees that we get the credibility we deserve. So if I do shoddy research, but I do it transparently, I may continue to do shoddy research, but it will be easier for people to know that it's shoddy. So the second pillar is the second part, which is going in and actually checking for errors and correcting them. So the critical appraisal part. And I would argue that we should be proud of the strides we've made in transparency. Those are extremely important, but that's the easy part. And the critical appraisal is going to be the much harder part. And part of the reason for that is, as Kurt Vonnegut observed another flaw in the human character is that everybody wants to build and nobody wants to do maintenance. So most scientists would rather make a discovery than go in and check a colleague's work and see if their discovery holds up, right? And we also select for that. So I would point out, as a friend of mine mentioned to me the other day when I used this quote, there are actually plenty of people who want to do maintenance. We just don't select them into research. And so we should consider that as well. But I would say that there's still probably a tendency to prefer discovery to verification work, and that's exacerbated when a field has certain people that they elevate to become almost untouchable, right? If it's really risky to criticize a high status person, then you may shy away from doing that verification work on their papers. Or when there are certain topics that it's just really costly to criticize. So if someone publishes a paper with a conclusion that everybody wants it to be true, who's going to go in and criticize that and say, yeah, actually that's wrong. Like, I wish it was true too, but it's just not. So the first step in making it possible for a field to have criticism and critical appraisal is to try to reduce this special status that some researchers have or some topics have. And this is something that the sociologist of science, Robert Merton, talked a lot about, that everybody should have equal standing in science, at least their claims should have equal standing. So it shouldn't matter who made a claim, it should be subject to the same level of criticism. Okay, so what does that look like in practice? Again, let's try to get concrete. So a field that values criticism will have people who engage in reproducibility and replicability checks of each other's work. And I'll talk a little bit about what I mean by those words. So there will be people doing this. You will see in the field a lot of people checking the reproducibility of each other's work, conducting replications. That would be a healthy field. So in psychology, we've started doing that, and the results are kind of ugly, but at least we're doing it. So let me tell you a little bit about that. So reproducibility here, I mean going in and reanalyzing the same data, the original data that the researchers used. So if I publish a finding and I post my data, then another researcher could come along and download my data and check that they get the same results as I published with my data. So this is starting to be possible in psychology because of the transparency, because of open data. And so a meta-researcher, Tom Hardwick, did the extremely labor-intensive work of going to a journal that requires authors to post their data, downloading 35 articles and their 35 data sets, and attempting to reproduce every statistical result in those papers. And he and his team spent many hours on each paper. And after their efforts, they were able to reproduce 11 out of the 35 papers. They were able to reproduce every result in that paper. For another 11, they were able to do that, but only after getting assistance from the original authors. And for 13 out of the 35 papers, they were never able to fully reproduce every result in the paper, even after getting help from the authors. And this is for a journal where the authors selected that journal knowing that they would have to post their data. So they were probably more careful than the average researcher to make sure their data are valid. So again, this is maybe not good news for us as a field, but it's good that we're doing this, right? And we need meta researchers like Tom Hardwick, like others that whose results I've put up, to do this investigation. That is what a healthy field looks like. That's what allows us to say in NAS reports, science is self-correcting, science is trustworthy. Okay, what about replicability? So by replicability, I mean actually collecting new data. So trying to redo the study the same way that the original authors do it, collecting new data and seeing if we get results consistent with the original. Here, there are many, many different slides, graphics I could put up showing you the outcomes of replication studies in psychology and in social sciences and cancer biology. The fields where we have looked, things do not look good. But again, I think that this is a good step that we're doing these replications, that we're trying to get an estimate of how many of our results are replicable. So instead of putting up a graph, I'll put up a cartoon, a couple of panels from a cartoon that was published in 2016 by Makinaro. The first is a panel of your own Alex Holcomb from Sydney Uni, saying the idea that fewer than half of results that are published, many of which were heavily covered by the media, are actually true is very dismaying. And this is a pretty good summary of the replication results in psychology. Fewer than half of results that are submitted to replication attempts are successful. And again, these are like, many of these are studies that made it into textbooks, made it into the most prestigious journals, etc. And then later in the cartoon, I make an appearance and I say, that seems problematic to me. So that's all I'll say on replication today, but I'm happy to talk more about replication since it's such a core feature of this crisis. Another sign of a field that values critical appraisal is post-publication review. Does the criticism continue after the paper is accepted for publication? because again, peer review is really not a good safeguard against scientific error. It's a first pass, but not a guarantee. There's, again, some growing interest in this in psychology and other fields. So there's a new company called Red Team Market where you can hire a critic, like companies do, right? So if you have data science in your company, you would want to make sure that that's robust. You might hire some people to serve as a red team to stress test your analyses. And now with Red Team Market, scientists can do this. And one scientist has actually already used their services and blogged about it. And this is what credibility looks like to me, right? I would believe a finding more if it has been subjected to more criticism, if the author has invited criticism, even paid for it. And there's a new mechanism called registered reports that more and more fields are adopting, where that criticism is invited very early in the process. So this is a mechanism that journals offer, where authors can submit their work, and it goes out for peer review before the data are collected. So authors design their study, they write up their plan, their method, their planned analyses, and so on, and the justification, the introduction. That goes out for peer review. After review, if it gets a positive evaluation from the journal offers an in-principle acceptance to the researchers. So as long as the researchers follow their plan, their paper will be published regardless of the results. So this provides a safeguard against the journal being biased by the results, so saying, oh, actually, now that we see the results, we don't want that, which leads to problems and bias in the literature. And it's a safeguard against authors p-hacking or messing with their results to try to get more exciting results, which they don't necessarily do intentionally, but often if we have the flexibility, we might kind of polish our results a little bit. Now, with all of these things, if you're going to pay your critics, or if you're going to ask for peer review before you actually design the study, if you're going to get a lot of feedback on your work and at a time and a place where you can use it and fix it, improve it, that's definitely going to make science better. But it's going to make science even better if those critics all have different perspectives, different biases, different assumptions. So another really important part of a well-functioning field that really values self-correction is the diversity of the researchers in that field. So this was summarized in that same book by Naomi Oreskes. It's actually an idea that I think is most often attributed to Helen Longino, the philosopher of science, which is the idea that the greater the diversity of a scientific community, the greater the degree of objectivity it may be able to achieve as individual biases and background assumptions are outed. So the idea here is that none of us individually are objective, but if we have different biases, different backgrounds, different assumptions that we're bringing to the table, then our biases will somewhat cancel each other out and we'll reach a more objective answer together. Okay, and then there's some things we can do at the level of the literature or the field to ask ourselves, is this set of results, is our literature believable and credible? So one thing we can look at is the balance of positive to negative results. And here I mean, a positive result is a claim of discovery, usually a statistically significant result in psychology, for example. A negative result is, oh, our intervention didn't work, or there is no association. And there's a lot of research showing that across many fields, the literature is extremely biased towards positive results. 70, 80, 90% of published research is positive results. You rarely see negative results, and psychology is one of the worst, around 95%. Some researchers, two different teams actually, had the really good idea to go into the registered report literature that's supposed to eliminate or reduce most of these biases and see, okay, well, what % of results are positive, successful, work, et cetera, when we close those doors to those biases. And what they both teams independently found a similar pattern, which is that when you compare it to the regular literature, not registered reports, in the regular literature, the top bar, only about 5 to 20% of results are negative results. Things didn't work, there's no difference, no association. Again, psychology is more like 5%. Among registered reports, it's 55, 60, 65%. So when you close the door to a lot of biases, all of a sudden, a lot more results can come out negative. This is a healthy field. This is what it should look like, right? Scientists' hypotheses aren't always right, and their research shouldn't always work out. And these negative results are really important too. They tell us about things that don't work, about differences that aren't there. And a literature that omits those results or manages to change them into positive results is a really biased literature. You can also do tests of bias on the entire literature, looking at things like the distribution of p-values among significant results. I won't go into that too much, but if you're interested, I'm happy to talk more about that. And other kind of signs of bias, forensic tests that you can do at the level of the literature to ask, is this body of evidence credible, or are there signs of bias? Another way to look at a field's valuing of criticism is to look for corrections, retractions, etc. Now here, I think it's a complicated question to ask what's the ideal level, right? So a field that retracts, half of its papers is probably not doing well, but a field that has no retractions and no corrections, that's not a trustworthy field either. And then finally, I think an important thing that anybody can use to evaluate a field, even a field we're outsiders to, is how often do they make extraordinary claims? It's just not plausible in a scientific field that there will be groundbreaking, earth-shattering results every day. And coming from a field, social and personality psychology, where we do a lot of stuff that gets media attention. We study things like romantic relationships and power and leadership. So it's very easy to get in the media. And I think one of the ways we went wrong is kind of eating that up and letting that go to our heads. And we realized, oh, if we make these really strong claims, we get rewarded. So a field should have a balance of, messy results and the occasional really extraordinary results. But if it's all extraordinary results, that is a big red flag. Another way to think about this is when we see an extraordinary result, right? We think, wow, that's incredible. Oops. And there's two meanings of incredible, right? Like, it's incredible, but if everything is incredible, then it should become incredible in the other sense, in this sense of not believable, not plausible, not credible. All right, so again, I would argue that we should look for these signs. So some of the things I've talked about here are just a few of the signs. That's not an exhaustive list, but look for signs, concrete evidence that a field prioritizes transparency and criticism if you want to know if that field is trustworthy. So in the case of transparency, ask, do researchers make it easy to see what they did? And is the peer review process and other processes, are they clear enough that people can scrutinize them and hold them accountable? On the critical appraisal side, you can ask, are criticism and verification common and rewarded and not punished, not dragged through the mud? And does the body of evidence look credible? Or are there too many claims of extraordinary results or too many significant results? So I think there are two lessons here. One is for us as scientists and one for us as citizens. So as scientists, I think the first lesson is that self-correction is hard and it doesn't magically happen, it takes work. And I think this is best captured in another quote, another tweet by James Heathers, a Sydney Uni grad, who said, science is self-correcting, sure, when we correct it, not because of magical progress. And for me, I think this was the lesson that took a really long time to sink in, and it was only through teaching undergraduates about what it is about science that makes it trustworthy that I realized it's actually hard to answer that question. You have to earn it. You don't just magically become trustworthy because what you do is called science. The other lesson is for us just as individuals, as citizens, as people in the world, and this connects really to the theme of this lecture series, trust and knowledge, which is that we have some way of judging when a scientific claim is credible. There are ways to tell what's more or less credible, even when we're not experts in that field. And this was captured in a tweet by Carl Bergstrom, the importance of this. This was just a couple of days ago. I asked him if I could use this as my closing slide. And he said in this tweet, it's a really good thread. You should look up his whole thread. But he said, what we need in this age of mis and disinformation is for every member of our society to be a competent outsider. By this, we mean that we need a society made of people who, while not individually expert, are capable of understanding when scientific claims are trustworthy. And so I think we're starting to make progress on this, not just asking for blind trust in science or saying science says so, but saying, no, the reason you should trust us is because we're committed to self-correction. We do that through a process of organized distrust. And this is what it looks like. We ask researchers to share their data when they can. We ask, reviews are made public so people can see what kind of scrutiny a paper was submitted to. We pay people to criticize each other's work. We give them awards and jobs and grants when they've shown themselves to be good critics who make other people's work better and detect errors in their work. So I hope I've given you some concrete answer to the question of where are the self-correcting mechanisms in science. And another point I want to make is that it's really important that the community that does this is a diverse community. And a lot of the results I've shown you here were made possible because of meta-scientists and meta-researchers who went in and studied those scientific communities. So those are also really important components to a healthy scientific ecosystem and trust and knowledge. So thank you very much.